It was an unusually quiet evening in Fenton, Ohio. People in this little town loved their calm lives, where nothing much happened. But that particular evening, the atmosphere carried an odd stillness. Luther Banks, a tall black man in his late 50s, was driving his old gray sedan down Oakwood Avenue, looking like any other man on his way home after a long day. But Luther wasn't just any man. He was an undercover FBI agent working on a highly confidential case. Luther was tasked to gather evidence on a dangerous gang suspected of dealing arms in Fenton. The gang members weren't just regular criminals. They had deep connections with powerful people. Luther had spent months undercover, collecting evidence little by little, and that night was a crucial night. He had an important lead to follow, and he needed to be careful not to blow his cover. As he drove down Oakwood, a set of flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. A police car was tailing him. Luther's pulse quickened. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but in this line of work, you could never be too sure of who might recognize you. The police car, driven by Officer Roy Hemmings, pulled up beside him and signaled him to pull over. Roy Hemmings was known around town, but not for the right reasons. His temper and attitude toward people of color had caused murmurs for years, though no one dared confront him. The folks around Fenton knew he had a quick temper and was particularly harsh when he didn't get the answers he wanted. Luther pulled over as instructed. He had his FBI badge tucked in his wallet, but showing it too soon would blow his cover, especially if Roy Hemmings had connections to the gang he was investigating. The officer got out of his cruiser and marched over to Luther's car with a certain edge in his step. "You're out late, aren't you?" Hemmings sneered, his hand resting on his holster. "Where you headed?" Luther kept his voice steady. "Just heading home, officer." "Something wrong?" "Funny," Hemmings replied, looking him up and down. "Haven't seen you around these parts before. Let me see your license and registration." Luther obliged, handing over the requested documents. Roy's eyes squinted as he scanned Luther's license. He leaned down, peering into Luther's eyes. "You're a long way from home, Luther Banks. Where exactly do you work?" he asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. Luther thought fast, sticking to his cover story. "I work at Willis Construction Company over in Cleveland. Just helping out with a few projects here." Roy snorted, clearly not convinced. "Step out of the car," he commanded. Luther hesitated but complied, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. As soon as he stepped out, Roy roughly grabbed him by the arm and twisted it behind his back, causing Luther to wince. Passers-by slowed down, some watching this scene unfold. But in a small town like Fenton, no one dared intervene. "You think you can lie to me?" Roy hissed. "You don't belong here." Luther took a breath. He knew he couldn't reveal his identity yet. He had to find a way out of this without causing a scene that could jeopardize the entire case. But as Roy tightened his grip, Luther realized this wasn't going to be as simple as he had hoped. Luther stood silently, feeling the cold metal of handcuffs as Roy snapped them around his wrists. He clenched his fists, not out of fear, but from the knowledge that he couldn't fight back. A few onlookers had their phones out, recording the arrest, but nobody dared speak up. Roy grinned, seemingly enjoying his small victory. "What's wrong, Mr. Construction Worker? Not so tough now, huh?" Roy taunted as he shoved Luther toward his squad car. Luther remained calm, knowing that he had to play this carefully. Revealing his badge now could still ruin his cover, and he wasn't willing to throw away months of work. As Roy shoved Luther into the back of the police car, Luther noticed another officer standing nearby. Officer Patricia Harvey, a young woman, had just finished a traffic stop down the street and had come over to see what was going on. She had heard stories about Roy Hemmings and his rough ways, but she had never directly confronted him before. Tonight, something in her wouldn't let her look away. "Roy, what's going on here?" Patricia asked, stepping closer. Roy shot her a look. "Just handling business. This guy here? He's a troublemaker, if you ask me." Patricia tilted her head. "Troublemaker? He looks like he was just driving home," she replied. Roy rolled his eyes. "Patricia, you're new here. Don't question me on this." He looked at her with an intensity that warned her to back off. But Patricia wasn't the type to let things slide so easily, especially when they didn't feel right. "I'd like to check his ID myself," she said firmly. She approached the police car where Luther was seated, peering in to make eye contact with him. Luther met her gaze, and something in his eyes caught her attention. They held a calm strength, one that seemed out of place for an ordinary civilian. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. "Luther Banks," he replied, nodding slightly. Patricia could tell there was more to this story, but Roy interrupted before she could press further. "This isn't your business, Harvey," he snapped, grabbing her arm and pulling her aside. "I know how to handle this." Patricia glanced down at Roy's grip on her arm, her face hardening. "You know, Roy, I don't think you're handling it right at all." Roy's face went red, but he released her. She took a step back, but her suspicions were already growing. She decided to take a closer look at the ID he had collected from Luther. And that's when she saw something peculiar, a small, barely visible mark near Luther's name, a subtle hint that this was no ordinary ID. In that moment, Patricia realized she had to dig deeper. But Roy wasn't going to make it easy. He was watching her every move, his face a twisted mask of anger. But Patricia was determined. If there was more to Luther than met the eye, she intended to find out. As Patricia's curiosity grew, she decided to make a bold move. With a quick, determined step, she returned Luther's ID to him through the open car window and whispered, "Is there something I need to know?" Luther gave her a slow nod, just enough to confirm her suspicions without speaking a word. She caught the hint and turned back toward Roy, who was still fuming. "I think we need to handle this at the station, Roy," Patricia said, keeping her tone calm. She knew it would be the only way to get Luther into a secure place without causing more suspicion. Begrudgingly, Roy agreed, muttering under his breath as he started the car. Once they reached the station, Patricia waited until they had a private moment. She motioned for Luther to speak, and he finally revealed his FBI badge. Her eyes widened with a mix of surprise and respect. "Undercover," she whispered, and Luther nodded. The pieces clicked into place, and Patricia knew they needed to find a way to deal with Roy before things escalated further. She quickly arranged for a senior officer to speak with Luther, and soon the tables began to turn. In a swift twist of fate, Roy found himself under investigation. Patricia had gathered enough evidence from the traffic stop video to show that Roy had violated proper conduct. Luther's case went forward, and the gang he was investigating was finally exposed. As for Roy, his misconduct had caught up with him, and he was suspended pending an official inquiry. Patricia had ensured justice prevailed, and Luther returned to his mission with renewed determination. And this brings us to the end of this story. Thank you for watching till the end. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends too. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more fascinating stories. Have a nice day.